The rain came down in violent sheets, hammering against the reinforced glass walls of the penthouse safe house as if the city itself was trying to break inside. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the skyline below for a brief second before plunging everything back into darkness. The soundproofed room muted the thunder, but the storm still felt present, pressing in, heavy and relentless. Emma Rodriguez sat on the edge of a leather sofa that cost more than most people's homes, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The room smelled faintly of whiskey, gun oil, and expensive cologne. It was the smell of Jackson Stone's world, a world that was about to spit her out. Jackson stood near the windows, his back to her, his tall frame perfectly composed in a tailored black suit. Even in stillness, he radiated danger. He was not just a wealthy man, he was feared, whispered about, obeyed without question. Jackson Stone ruled his empire the way others ruled countries, through silence, calculated violence, and the understanding that crossing him meant disappearance. Men died for less than mistakes. Loyalty was currency, emotion was weakness, and Emma once had been his wife. Now she was an inconvenience being removed. Two syndicate lawyers sat at the long glass table between them, their faces impassive, their movements precise. They did not look at Emma with pity or curiosity. To them she was already erased. One of them slid a thick folder across the table. It stopped inches from Emma's knees. The papers inside were not divorce documents. There was no talk of shared assets or separation terms. This was an exile contract, a clean severing, a declaration that she no longer belonged under Jackson Stone's protection. The woman lawyer spoke in a calm, neutral voice, explaining what the document meant. Emma would leave the marriage with nothing, no money, no properties, no accounts, no security detail, no access to Jackson's name or influence. She would revert to her maiden name, stripped of the status that had once made doors open and people bow. The safe houses, the drivers, the unspoken shields that had kept her untouched in a brutal city would vanish the moment she signed. Emma listened without interrupting. Each sentence felt like another layer of skin being peeled away. She had known this was coming. She had felt it in the weeks of silence, the way Jackson stopped looking at her as anything more than a fixture in his life, an object placed in a room and forgotten. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made the reality suffocating. Jackson did not turn around. He did not argue or soften the blow. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, empty of emotion. He said this was necessary, that the arrangement no longer served its purpose, that she would be safer outside his world. It was said like a logistical observation, not a lie meant to comfort. Emma realized then that he truly believed it. To him, this was not heartbreak, it was housekeeping. She looked at his reflection in the dark glass. The man who had once promised her forever now looked like a stranger. There was no apology in his posture, no hesitation, just finality. The lawyer placed a pen beside the folder. Emma felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest. This was the line between survival and annihilation. Exile in the Mafia world was not just separation, it was exposure. Without Jackson's protection, she would be vulnerable to enemies who had always seen her as leverage. Women disappeared for less, mistakes were punished brutally, and yet, as fear crawled up her spine, something else rose to meet it. Pride. Emma picked up the pen. Her hands did not shake. She did not ask questions. She did not beg. She did not cry. The lawyers watched closely, perhaps expecting hesitation, a plea, a crack. It never came. She signed her name page after page, each stroke steady, deliberate, reclaiming her identity even as she lost everything else. When she finished, she set the pen down gently. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Emma stood. For the first time that night, Jackson turned to face her. Their eyes met. His were cold, assessing, already moving on. Hers were clear, stripped, unafraid. She did not thank him. She did not curse him. She simply looked at him, committing the moment to memory. This was the night he took everything. This was the night she walked into danger with nothing but herself. Without another word, Emma turned and walked toward the door. The locks disengaged with a mechanical click. The storm waited for her on the other side. As the door closed behind her, Jackson Stone remained in the penthouse, ruler of an empire built on blood and silence, convinced he had just eliminated a weakness. He did not yet understand that he had created something far more dangerous. And Emma Rodriguez stepped into the rain knowing one truth above all others. Exile would either kill her or forge her into something no one, not even a mafia boss, could ever erase again. Jackson Stone had not always been a man made of ice, but power had trained him to erase anything that slowed him down, and Emma had learned this too late. She remembered the early days when his attention felt intoxicating, when his presence filled rooms and made people nervous. And when he looked at her like she was something rare, something chosen back, then she thought his silence meant depth, his control meant safety. She did not understand that in his world love was tolerated only as long as it did not interfere with dominance, and the longer she stayed, the more she disappeared piece by piece, until even her reflection looked like someone waiting for permission to exist. The truth was that Emma had not been erased in one moment. It had happened slowly, quietly, over dinners she ate alone in echoing rooms overnights. She waited awake while he returned, smelling of smoke and rain and men who would never betray him. She learned not to ask questions because answers came with consequences. She learned to smile when dangerous men stared too long, and to lower her eyes when deals were discussed in coded language. She became invisible by design because visible women in that world were targets. And Jackson had allowed it because it was efficient, because it kept things clean. What finally broke her was not violence or shouting or betrayal in the way movies promised. It was laughter. She had overheard Jackson on a secure call late one night, his voice relaxed, amused, as he spoke to a trusted man about territory and profits and mistakes. And somewhere between strategy and indifference, he referred to her as one he should have cut loose earlier, a complication, a woman who brought nothing to the table. The words were not shouted, they were worse spoken casually, like facts already settled. Emma had stood in the shadowed hallway listening to her own worth being reduced to an inconvenience, and in that moment something inside her went quiet. She confronted him that night standing barefoot on cold marble while he loosened his cufflinks, and listened with mild irritation. When she asked him if any of it had been real, he did not deny it, he did not apologize. He told her that people evolve and attachments expire, and that sentiment had no place in survival. His honesty was surgical, clean, and devastating. And when she asked what would happen to her, he looked at her the way one looks at a problem already solved, and said arrangements would be made. Now those arrangements had arrived, and as Emma moved through the elevator descending from the sky into the city below, she felt the full weight of what exile meant. Jackson Stone did not threaten. He did not need to. His absence was the danger. Without his name, doors would close. Without his protection, eyes would linger too long. Questions would be asked, and answers would be demanded in blood. The city was not kind to women who once belonged to powerful men, because everyone wanted a piece of what they thought remained. Outside the building, the rain swallowed her whole, soaking through her coat, her hair, her carefully composed shell. She stood there for a moment, unsure of which direction to walk, because every road she had known led back to him, drivers, guards, safe routes all gone. She raised her face to the storm and let it wash over her, because if she was going to break, it would not be in front of anyone who might report it back to him. She took a cab to a part of the city Jackson never visited, a neighborhood where power did not announce itself with tinted windows and armed men, where survival looked ordinary and unglamorous. And when her cousin opened the door and pulled her inside without questions, Emma finally understood the cost of what she had lost and the strange freedom buried beneath it. She lay awake that night listening to unfamiliar sounds, sirens, neighbors' footsteps above her, and fear wrapped itself around her ribs like wire, but beneath it something else stirred. Anger. Jackson Stone had removed her because he believed she would fade without him, disappear into the cracks of the city, and maybe that was what should have happened. But as Emma stared into the dark, she realized that for the first time in years she was afraid and alive at the same time. Exile had stripped her of everything except one thing: he could never control the will to survive, and in a world ruled by fear, that alone could become power. Emma learned what no protection truly meant within the first hour of walking the streets without Jackson Stone's shadow wrapped around her name. Every sound felt louder, every glance sharper, every pause stretched too long. The city no longer parted for her, no longer looked away. When she passed, she felt eyes follow her not with admiration, but calculation, the kind that measured risk, and reward, the kind that decided whether someone was worth taking. The cab ride to her cousin's neighborhood felt like crossing an invisible border. Glass towers fell away, replaced by narrow streets buzzing with life and noise and desperation. This was a city that survived without power, without shields, without names that made people afraid. And it terrified her more than Jackson's world ever had, because here danger did not announce itself with armed men and black cars. It hid in ordinary faces and ordinary corners. And when the cab finally stopped, Emma realized her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the understanding that she was alone in a way she had never been before. Inside the apartment, the walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the air smelled like food and laundry and real life. Rosa did not ask questions. She did not mention Jackson or money, or why Emma arrived soaked and hollow. She simply pulled her inside and locked the door behind them, and that small gesture undid something Emma had been holding together by force. She sat on the edge of the bed later, staring at a cracked ceiling, listening to footsteps above her and voices through the walls, and she understood that this place offered no luxury, no protection, no illusion, but it offered something Jackson never had: safety without conditions. Sleep did not come easily. Every noise jolted her awake: a door slamming outside, a car alarm, a distant shout. Her mind filled the dark with threats, because that was what she had been trained to expect. She knew too much about the world she had left behind. She knew how quickly women who once belonged to powerful men became targets, how information spread, how enemies looked for leverage and weakness and proof of survival. Fear pressed against her chest until breathing felt like work. The days that followed were worse without Jackson's resources. Emma had no driver, no routes, no warnings. She stood in grocery lines and on sidewalks, exposed, learning how to keep her head down, how to blend, and how to move like someone who had nothing worth stealing. She cut her hair shorter, wore simpler clothes, erased the last traces of the woman who had lived above the city. And yet, even as she hid, she felt watched. Sometimes she caught men lingering too long near building entrances. Sometimes she noticed the same car twice in one afternoon, and she could not tell if it was paranoia or instinct, and in her world, instinct had kept people alive. Money became another kind of fear. She counted what little she had left, realizing how fast it could vanish. She applied for work under her maiden name, swallowing pride she had not needed to use in years. And when the first rejection came, it burned deeper than Jackson's indifference, because this time there was no shield, no name to soften the blow. Survival depended on her alone. One evening, as she walked home with groceries, the sky darkened and rain began again, heavy and relentless, soaking through her clothes. The storm felt familiar, like the night of her exile. And as thunder rolled, Emma stopped under a flickering streetlight and finally let herself acknowledge the truth. Exile was not just about losing comfort. It was about being hunted by possibility, by hunger, by fear, by the knowledge that if she fell, there would be no one to catch her. And yet, beneath the fear, something else began to harden: resolve. Jackson Stone had believed removing his protection would reduce her to nothing. But standing there in the rain, Emma felt the opposite happening. Stripped of everything, she had nothing left to lose. And that made her dangerous in a way. Even she did not yet understand. The city did not know it, but it had just gained a woman who refused to disappear. And whether this world devoured her or forged her, she would meet it standing, not begging, not broken, but awake and ready to survive. Emma first noticed something was wrong when mornings became unbearable. The smell of cooking oil from the diner downstairs made her stomach turn, and the world felt tilted, as if gravity itself had shifted. She told herself it was exhaustion, because fear had been her constant companion since exile, because sleep came in fragments, and her body was still adjusting to survival without protection. But deep inside her chest, a quiet knowing began to form, and it terrified her more than any threat she had imagined. She counted days on her fingers in the dark of the small bedroom, replaying memories she had tried to bury, and when the truth finally surfaced, it did so without mercy. The test rested in her shaking hand as rain tapped softly against the bathroom window. 2 lines stared back at her, unblinking, undeniable. The air felt thin, her heart pounded so hard she feared it would give her away. Even though she was alone, the child was his. There was no question. The timing aligned perfectly with the last weeks before exile, before cold logic had replaced any trace of care. She slid down onto the floor, pressing her back against the wall as the weight of it crushed her. She was carrying the blood Jackson Stone, a man whose name alone could start wars, whose enemies collected leverage like currency, whose world devoured weakness without hesitation. Fear moved quickly through her thoughts, sharp and precise. If the syndicate learned of this child, the baby would never belong to itself. It would become a tool, a threat, a bargaining chip. If Jackson learned, he would claim ownership not out of love but legacy. And in his world, legacy was protected with violence. She imagined armed men watching playgrounds, imagined her daughter growing up behind walls, learning silence before words. And something inside Emma hardened into resolve. She would not allow her child to be raised as a shadow or a weapon. That decision formed in stillness, without drama, without tears. She would disappear further than exile. She would erase this truth from every channel that could reach him. She would carry the child alone if she had to. She would work until her body broke before she handed her baby over to a world built on blood and fear. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling nothing yet, but understanding everything. The mafia boss had taken her name, her protection, her life. But this he would never take unless she allowed it, and she would not. The days that followed were filled with careful choices. She avoided hospitals that asked too many questions. She used her maiden name everywhere she went. She told no one, except her cousin, who listened in stunned silence. Before nodding in fierce loyalty, money became a countdown clock. She calculated how many weeks she could survive, how many shifts she could take, how many hours her body could endure as it changed and grew heavier with responsibility. Fear never left, but it transformed into focus, into preparation, into the quiet discipline she had learned in Jackson's world but now used against it. At night, as the city hummed beyond thin walls, Emma lay awake, imagining a future. She had not planned a child with gray eyes and a name untainted by violence. She promised that life would be simple, honest, safe, even if it was hard, even if it hurt. Exile had stripped her of everything. But in its place, it had given her a reason stronger than fear, stronger than loss. She was no longer just surviving, she was protecting. And in the mafia world, that choice alone was an act of defiance that could change everything. Emma entered survival the way others entered war, quietly, deliberately, with no expectation of mercy. Each morning began before the sun rose and ended long after it disappeared. And in between, she learned how invisible exhaustion could be when hunger and fear shared the same space inside her. She took a job at a diner where the floors were always sticky, and the customers rarely looked her in the eye, and she learned to smile through nausea and back pain because tips mattered more than dignity. She wiped counters, carried plates, and memorized faces, not to be friendly, but to stay alert, because in her world attention could be dangerous, and anonymity was a shield she wore like armor. When the diner closed, she changed uniforms in the bathroom and went to clean houses for people who lived lives. She once recognized marble kitchens, framed photos, expensive silence, and no curiosity about the woman scrubbing their floors. She preferred it that way. She listened while she worked, noting how easily people spoke around those they believed powerless. And she used that knowledge to survive. She babysat in the evenings, rocking other people's children to sleep while her body ached and her stomach tightened with each passing week. She counted every dollar, folding bills carefully and hiding them in an envelope under her mattress, using her maiden name everywhere, leaving no trail, no connection, no history. Pregnancy changed her body faster than she expected. Her feet swelled, her breath shortened, and sometimes the world spun suddenly without warning. But she did not stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant fear. She learned to eat simply, cheaply, and enough to keep going. She ignored the looks from strangers and the questions from coworkers, because explanation invited attention, and attention was risk. At night, she lay awake with her hand over her stomach, whispering promises to a child who could not hear her, yet promising safety, promising choice, promising a life untouched by the rules that had almost destroyed her. It was in the quiet hours after work that something unexpected happened in the small kitchen of her cousin's apartment. Emma began to bake. At first, it was instinct, muscle memory from a childhood spent watching her grandmother turn simple ingredients into comfort. She mixed flour, sugar, eggs, hands steady, mind calm. For the first time in months, the act of creating something warm and whole from nothing soothed her. She experimented late into the night, testing flavors, adjusting heat, learning again how patience could transform raw elements into something beautiful. She shared the results reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence when people asked for more. Orders came slowly, then steadily. Neighbors, coworkers, friends of friends who paid in cash and thanked her like she had given them more than dessert. She realized she had found something that belonged only to her, something untouched by Jackson Stone or fear or exile. It was work that rewarded care rather than obedience, and each small success rebuilt a piece of herself she had thought lost forever. She saved for better tools, better ingredients, better chances, all while her body grew heavier with the life she protected. Danger still hovered. She noticed unfamiliar faces, sometimes lingering near the building. She changed routes, stayed unpredictable, trusted instinct over comfort, and never spoke of the past. She understood that survival was not just endurance, it was strategy. Exile had not broken her, it had trained her. Stripped of luxury and illusion, she became precise, adaptable, relentless. And as her child grew stronger inside her, Emma realized that she was no longer running, she was building something quietly, powerfully. In the shadows, and the world that had discarded her would one day feel the weight of that decision. The night Emma went into labor, the city felt unusually quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The pain began low and sharp, then spread in waves that stole her balance and forced her to grip the edge of the kitchen counter until her knuckles burned. She did not call anyone at first because she had learned to measure danger in attention and panic attracted eyes. She waited until the pain demanded movement, until her body made the decision for her. And then she wrapped herself in a coat, grabbed the small bag she had prepared in silence, and stepped into the street where the air smelled of rain and metal and distance. The ride to the public hospital blurred into a rhythm of breath and memory. Streetlights streaked past the window, while contractions tightened and released like a countdown. She thought of Jackson Stone, not with longing, but with clarity. She thought of the night he erased her, and the promise she had made to protect what was growing inside her, no matter the cost. Inside the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed and strangers moved quickly around her, asking questions. She answered with her maiden name, only her voice steady, even as pain threatened to pull her apart. There were no private rooms, no whispered reassurances, only necessity and endurance, and the understanding that this moment belonged to her alone. Hours passed without mercy. Pain became something she moved through rather than resisted, and when exhaustion threatened to drown her, she focused on the life she was bringing into the world. She pushed with everything she had left. And when the cry finally came, sharp and real and undeniable, it cut through the room like light through darkness. The nurse placed the baby in her arms, and time collapsed into that single fragile weight, warm, alive, breathing. The fear that had followed Emma for months broke apart, replaced by a love so fierce it bordered on violence. She looked down and saw gray eyes, already searching, already aware, and she knew with certainty whose blood ran through those small veins. Emma named her Stella because stars guided travelers through darkness, because they burned quietly yet endlessly, because this child was the proof that something pure could exist even after everything had been taken. Stella wrapped her fingers around Emma's thumb, and the world shifted forever in that grip. Emma understood that fear would never leave her, but it would never rule her again. She memorized every detail, the shape of her daughter's mouth, the weight of her breath, the way her eyes held a familiar intensity, and she vowed that those eyes would never witness the world that had almost claimed them. Leaving the hospital days later, Emma felt exposed again. The city watched with indifferent patience, but now she carried more than herself. She adjusted her routines further, trusted fewer people, changed routes and names and habits. Motherhood sharpened her instincts until they bordered on instinctual violence. Anyone who came too close felt like a threat. Anyone who asked too much felt dangerous. She kept Stella hidden, not out of shame, but out of strategy, because in the world Emma knew children of powerful men were not children, they were leverage, and she refused to allow her daughter to become currency. Nights were the hardest, exhaustion pressed against her bones, while Stella cried and Emma rocked her in the dark, whispering stories of safety and choice, promising that this life would be different, promising that love would not come with conditions or fear or blood. She told her daughter that she was free, that her name would belong only to herself. And as the city breathed around them, Emma realized that exile had not ended her story, it had begun. It had stripped her to the core and revealed something unbreakable, a mother willing to stand against an empire to keep one small life safe, and that realization made her stronger than any protection Jackson Stone had ever offered. 2 years passed not quietly, but with the steady pressure of necessity shaping Emma into something sharper than survival. When most people slept, she worked. When most rested, she planned. And while Stella learned to walk, Emma learned how power really moved. She remembered the galas she once attended as decoration, remembered the rhythm of influence, how silence at the right moment mattered more than speech, how beauty without control was useless. She began small. Baking became more than comfort, it became currency. She offered flawless desserts for intimate gatherings, then quietly coordinated entire evenings for people who valued discretion above all else. She understood their language because she had lived inside it, and they trusted her because she never asked for more than she needed. Money arrived slowly at first, then steadily, and Emma reinvested every dollar with discipline, renting a small workspace, hiring help only when she could afford loyalty and consistency. She named her company Radiant Events, not because it was loud, but because it promised light without exposure, and soon word traveled not through advertisements, but through whispers that this woman delivered perfection and never spoke of what she saw. Emma dressed differently now, tailored suits altered by her own hands, hair pulled back, eyes steady. She no longer flinched at authority because she had learned what it cost, and what it hid. Stella grew beside her, curious, bright, watched over by trusted caregivers who knew nothing of the past and everything about boundaries. Emma built a schedule like a fortress. Every hour accounted for, every risk assessed. She turned former weakness into advantage, knowing how elites thought, how they feared embarrassment more than loss, how they valued loyalty disguised as professionalism. And when Radiant Events was asked to manage larger functions, she accepted with caution, never forgetting that visibility was both opportunity and threat. Then the call came from a syndicate front company requesting a high-profile launch, something expensive, controlled, powerful, the kind of event that signaled dominance without gunfire. Emma recognized the name immediately and felt the air shift. This was Jackson Stone territory. She understood what it meant to step into his world again, but retreat would draw attention, and she had learned that absence could be louder than presence, so she accepted calmly, professionally, prepared relentlessly. On the day of the meeting, she left Stella with her cousin, kissed her forehead longer than usual, then drove into the heart of the city where glass towers rose like monuments to control. The building loomed familiar and distant at once. And when Emma entered, she felt the old weight of power press against her shoulders, but it no longer bent her. Inside the conference room, executives gathered, voices, low eyes assessing. Then the door opened and Jackson Stone walked in, and time slowed. His presence still commanded. Room still carried danger, but something fractured in his expression. When he saw her, he had expected a ghost, a remnant of a mistake. Instead, he found a woman standing tall, unafraid, untouchable. Emma introduced herself with calm precision, using her maiden name, her voice steady, her gaze level. And in that moment, the balance shifted. Jackson watched as she presented her vision, confident, controlled, undeniable, and he understood too late that exile had not destroyed her, it had refined her, and the empire he ruled had just collided with the one she built in silence. The first time Jackson Stone realized something was wrong, it was not because of what Emma said, but because of what his body did when she spoke. His pulse shifted, his focus fractured, and the room that had always bent to his will suddenly felt unstable, as if the ground itself no longer recognized him. Emma moved through the venue like someone who owned the air around her, not hurried, not hesitant, every decision precise, every command calm. Men who once would have ignored her now waited for her approval without question, and Jackson watched from a distance, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the one he had exiled. He began appearing at the venue more often under the excuse of inspections and security reviews. But in truth, he was trying to map her presence, understand how she had slipped back into his world without permission, without fear, without need. Emma noticed, of course. She noticed everything, but she gave him nothing, no private glances, no emotional tells, no history. She spoke to him only when necessary, and only in the language of contracts, timelines, and logistics, each word placed carefully. A boundary he could not cross. Jackson commented once that she seemed different, stronger, and Emma responded with a polite acknowledgement that people adapt when circumstances require it. The words were simple, but the message cut deep. He had believed removing his protection would reduce her to desperation. Instead, it had forced evolution, and the realization unsettled him because power had always responded to him predictably, People feared him, begged him, or tried to deceive him. Emma did none of these. She existed beyond his reach, and that was more dangerous than defiance. As the launch date approached, Jackson found reasons to stay late, walking through the half-finished ballroom while crews adjusted lighting and sound. He watched Emma review details with her team, her posture confident, her voice low, but commanding, and something unfamiliar tightened in his chest, respect tinged with regret. He began asking questions unrelated to the event, where she had trained, how she built her company, how she gained trust so quickly. Emma answered without embellishment, without crediting anyone else. She spoke of work and discipline and necessity, never mentioning him, never acknowledging the world he had once provided, and that omission haunted him. At night, Jackson lay awake, replaying the meeting, the way Emma had introduced herself, the way she had shaken his hand without hesitation, without emotion, and he felt something close to panic, because power meant nothing if it could not command loyalty or fear, and Emma showed neither. His world had trained him to identify threats quickly, and this was not an enemy he could eliminate without destroying himself. What he did not yet understand was that the most dangerous thing in his world was not betrayal or rebellion, but silence, and Emma had mastered it. She moved carefully, protected her private life with ruthless efficiency, and every attempt Jackson made to learn more met closed doors, not by force, but by absence. There were no rumors, no leaks, no trails to follow, and that void gnawed at him. The tension reached its peak during a late evening walkthrough when the venue stood empty. Except for them, the lights dimmed, music testing softly in the background. Jackson stopped walking and turned to face her, asking why she had never contacted him, why she had never asked for help. Emma met his gaze then, and for the first time he saw something raw in her eyes, not weakness, but warning. She told him quietly that some doors once closed should never be reopened, because what lived behind them could destroy more than it saved. And then she turned away, leaving Jackson alone in the vast, unfinished space, feeling something he had never allowed himself to feel: uncertainty. He did not know yet that the truth was already circling him, that every instinct screaming at him was justified, that the reason Emma had returned untouched, unafraid, was because she had built a life so carefully protected that even a mafia boss could not claim it, and soon he would learn why the silence terrified him more than any enemy ever had. The report arrived on a secure channel late at night, when the city outside Jackson Stone's windows had gone quiet, and the empire he commanded rested on routine and fear. He opened it expecting financial summaries or security alerts. Instead, he found a name he had not allowed himself to think for too long: Emma Rodriguez. The file was concise, clinical, unforgiving. And as he read the first lines, something inside him began to fracture. Details unfolded without drama and address a history, a pattern of work, movement, and silence, and then a single sentence altered the shape of his world. Emma had been pregnant at the time of exile. The words did not shout, they did not accuse, they simply existed, and that was enough. Jackson read the sentence again, slower this time, as if speed had distorted meaning. But the truth did not change. The timeline aligned with brutal precision: the dates of exile, the nights he had been absent, the weeks he had dismissed as irrelevant, all converged into a single undeniable conclusion. He had removed protection from a woman carrying his child. His hands tightened on the desk, as a cold weight pressed into his chest, a sensation he did not recognize, because it was not fear or anger or dominance. It was realization. He scrolled further. The report continued with quiet efficiency: a birth record, a hospital name, a child listed under Emma's maiden name, a daughter named Stella. And then photographs taken from a distance: a park, a bench, a small figure running with uncoordinated joy, gray eyes unmistakable, even in low-resolution eyes that mirrored his own. And the resemblance was not subtle, it was undeniable. The bloodline he had guarded with violence and strategy had been walking freely in sunlight without him. For a moment Jackson felt rage rise, instinctive, sharp, demanding action. His world had taught him that information was leverage, and leverage demanded response. He could reclaim, assert authority, call lawyers and enforcers, redraw the board in his favor. But as quickly as the impulse formed, it collapsed under the weight of understanding. He had not been denied a child, he had abandoned one before she ever took her first breath, and the shame of that truth hollowed him in a way no enemy ever had. Memories surged uninvited Emma standing in the penthouse rain against glass, her steady hand signing exile papers. Without begging, Emma walking away, without looking back, and now Emma alone, pregnant, working, surviving, protecting a life. He had endangered. The realization was not cinematic, it was suffocating. It pressed on his ribs, stole his breath, and left him gripping the edge of the desk, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. The photographs pulled him deeper. He studied the way Emma bent toward the child, her posture protective, unguarded, the way Stella laughed unafraid. And something inside Jackson broke open. This was not a world he could conquer with money or fear, it was a life built deliberately without him. And for the first time, power offered no solution, only consequence. He closed the file, but the truth did not close with it. It followed him through the night, through sleepless hours, and into the morning when he drove to the park without security, without announcement, and sat in the car watching from a distance. Emma and Stella appeared together, sunlight on their faces. And Jackson did not step out, he did not approach, because every instinct he had ever trusted told him that forcing himself into that moment would destroy it. Tears came without permission, blurring his vision as he watched his daughter chase pigeons, and his exiled wife laugh freely. The empire he had built suddenly felt small, brittle, meaningless, and Jackson Stone understood with devastating clarity that his greatest failure was not losing Emma, but becoming the kind of man she had needed to protect her child from. And in that realization, the feared mafia boss met the truth: he could not outrun redemption, would require restraint, or he would lose them forever. Jackson Stone waited until the night before the launch because timing in his world had always been a weapon, and this time he intended to lay his weapons down when Emma arrived at the venue for the final walkthrough. The space glowed with controlled elegance, light reflecting off glass and polished stone. The empire she had built inside his territory stood complete and undeniable. And for the first time, Jackson did not feel like the man in control, he felt like a visitor asking permission to breathe. He asked to speak alone, not with authority but restraint, and Emma hesitated long enough to remind him that hesitation was now her power. When she finally agreed, sending her assistant away, Jackson did not step closer, he did not reach for her, he stood where he was and spoke the truth without armor. He told her he knew about Stella, and watched the color leave her face, watched instinct push her backward as if danger had finally caught up to her, and he accepted that reaction without protest. He told her how he found out, not to justify it but to be transparent, and then he apologized, not once, but completely. He did not ask for forgiveness, he did not demand explanation. He spoke of the woman she had been, of the child she protected, of the nights she endured alone, while he convinced himself logic was righteousness. And as he spoke, the feared mafia boss stripped himself of command and stood as a man confronting the wreckage of his own choices. Emma listened with her arms crossed, her silence sharper than any accusation, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not shake. She told him about hunger, about fear, about carrying life. While being erased, she told him that exile had almost broken her, and that love without safety was not love at all. Jackson absorbed every word without interruption, because for once he understood that power meant listening, not controlling. He offered nothing tied to obligation, no custody claims, no leverage, no demands, only an irrevocable bloodline fund for Stella set beyond his reach, and hers a future secured without chains. And he told Emma that whether she allowed him into their lives or not, he would do this because it was right, not because he expected reward. The word right tasted unfamiliar in his mouth, but he held it anyway. The launch the next night was flawless. Cameras flashed, influence gathered, and Jackson publicly praised radiant events without hint of history. When their eyes met across the room, something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement, not ownership. And for the first time, Emma felt seen without being claimed. Weeks followed, then months. Slow, careful, measured. Emma sought counsel, separated her anger from her daughter's future. And when she finally allowed Jackson to meet Stella, it was in daylight, in public, and under her rules. Jackson knelt not to command but to be small, and Stella, with gray eyes and fearless curiosity, accepted him without understanding the cost of that moment. Trust rebuilt not in declarations but in presence. Jackson learned how to wait, how to ask, how to earn, and Emma learned that redemption, when real, was quiet and earned one choice at a time. They did not rush toward a family, they built something new, honest, fragile, deliberate. And as the sun set one evening over a park where fear once ruled, Emma realized that exile had not been the end. It had been the fire that forged a future no empire could ever take from her, and Jackson Stone understood that true power was not what he ruled, but what he chose not to destroy.